The station had been dead for 43 years, but people kept arriving with suitcases full of grief. She thought she was restoring a building for him. She was learning how to let him go. Have you ever held on to something you should have released? The station stood like a ghost at the edge of town, its roof sagging under the weight of 40 years of silence. Elira Voss had driven past it 1,000 times without stopping. But this morning, something pulled her through the rusted gate. Dawn light filtered through fractured windows, painting the platform in stripes of gold and shadow. The air tasted of dust and decay, of things left behind too long. She set down the heavy toolbox at her feet and wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth creeping into the day. This was Ashbourne Junction. Once it had been the heart of the valley. Now it was just bones. She hadn't meant to buy it. After Matthias died, she'd been sorting through his papers and found the deed tucked inside an old railway map. He'd purchased it 6 months before the stroke took him. No explanation, no note. Just the deed and a photograph of the two of them standing on this very platform 30 years earlier, laughing, suitcases at their feet. Their honeymoon. They'd waited here for the morning train that would take them north, to the coast, to 7 days that felt like stepping into someone else's beautiful life. She remembered the way his hand had felt in hers. Steady, warm, alive. The station had been vibrant then. Flower boxes blooming red and gold along the platform edge. The ticket windows polished bright. Travelers milling about with the easy energy of people moving toward something. The clock above the entrance had shown the time clearly, its brass hands catching the sunlight. Now the flower boxes were long gone. The ticket windows were boarded shut. And the clock. Elira stepped closer, tilting her head back to look up at it. The hands were frozen at 3:47. She felt something tighten in her chest. 3:47. The exact time the last train had pulled away from Ashbourne Junction before the line was decommissioned. She'd read it in the town archives when she'd gone looking for the station's history, trying to understand why Matthias had wanted this place. Some places hold time hostage, she thought. This one held mine. She picked up the toolbox, iconic. His toolbox, the one he'd carried to every job site for 40 years, and walked toward the entrance. The metal handle of the door was ice cold against her palm, even in the growing warmth of morning. It resisted at first, hinges groaning, then gave way with a shriek that echoed across the empty platform. Inside, the waiting room smelled of mildew and old wood. Dust motes drifted through the light like snow that would never land. The ticket counter stretched along one wall, its surface scarred and weathered, the wood grain visible beneath layers of grime. She set the toolbox down and ran her fingers across the counter's edge, rough, splintered, forgotten. Behind the counter, the departures board still hung on the wall. Hand-painted letters faded to ghosts. She could barely make out the destinations. Belshire, Creston, Milford, Vale. Towns she'd never been to. Journeys that had ended decades ago. The wind pushed through a broken window somewhere above, and the station exhaled around her. The sound of it, Yamamak, low and mournful, reminded her of breathing, of something barely alive. She turned and looked back toward the platform. The tracks stretched out into the distance, rusted and overgrown with weeds. No trains had run here in 43 years. The town council had condemned the building 5 years ago, citing structural instability and no historical value worth preserving. But Matthias had seen something here, and now, standing in the hollow belly of Ashbourne Junction, Elira thought she understood. He hadn't bought this place to restore it. He'd bought it because it was a monument to things left unfinished, to goodbyes that never got spoken, to the way time could stop for some people while the rest of the world kept moving. She knelt on the platform, the concrete cold and gritty beneath her knees, and unlatched the toolbox. The lid opened with a soft click. Inside, his tools lay exactly as he'd left them. Hammer, screwdrivers, wrenches, each one worn smooth by decades of use. She lifted the hammer and felt the weight of it in her hand. His hand had held this, had shaped wood and stone and metal with it. Her throat tightened. She set the hammer down gently and closed her eyes. For a moment, she let herself feel the full weight of it. The grief, the loneliness, the unbearable quiet of a life that had once been shared and was now hers alone. Then she opened her eyes. She stood, brushed the dust from her knees, and walked back to the ticket counter. This time she didn't just touch it. She pressed both palms flat against the surface, leaning her weight into it, claiming the space. If he wanted me here, she thought, then I'll be here. Her shadow stretched long across the empty platform behind her, and somewhere above, the frozen clock marked a time that would never change. Not yet. The work began slowly, like waking from a long sleep. Elira arrived each morning at dawn, when the light was softest and the world still quiet. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees, the bristles of the brush scratching against decades of grime. The water in her bucket turned black within minutes. She emptied it, refilled it, and started again. The rhythm of it was something she could hold on to. Brush, scrub, rinse, repeat. She replaced broken windows one by one, cutting new glass to fit the warped frames. The sound of the hammer striking nails echoed through the empty station, sharp and insistent. Each strike felt like a small defiance against the silence that had claimed this place. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight as she moved from room to room. Some were soft with rot, those she marked with chalk to replace later. Others held firm, groaning but steady. The station was testing her, she thought, seeing if she'd stay. She would. The ticket counter took 3 full days to sand smooth. Matthias's tools fit her hands differently than they'd fit his. The screwdriver too thick in her grip, the plane heavier than she expected. But she learned the weight of them, learned to feel his presence in the worn wooden handles, in the way the hammer balanced just right if she held it a certain way. Sometimes she caught herself speaking aloud. "This one's stubborn," she'd say, wrestling with a rusted hinge. Or, "You'd have done this faster." The station never answered, but it listened. She was sure of that. By the end of the first week, she'd peeled away layers of old paint from the window frames, revealing the original green beneath. The timetables on the wall were too yellowed and brittle to save, curling at the edges like ancient scrolls. She left them for now. They felt like part of the station's memory. The departures board still hung behind the ticket counter, its hand-painted letters faded but legible. Belshire, Creston, Milford, Vale, destinations that no longer mattered, roads that had closed decades ago. She stood before it one afternoon, tracing the names with her fingertips. Journeys never taken, she thought, or taken and never returned from. It was while she stood there that Senna Dre arrived. Elira heard the soft footsteps on the platform first, then turned to see the older woman standing in the doorway, a basket over one arm. Senna was nearly 70, her hair silver and tied back, her face lined with the kind of kindness that came from weathering storms without bitterness. "I brought bread," Senna said, stepping inside, "and tea, if you have a way to heat water." Elira gestured to the small camp stove she'd set up in the corner. "I can manage that." They sat together on the platform, legs dangling over the edge, and shared the bread in silence. The tea was strong and bitter, the way Elira liked it. Senna didn't ask questions at first. She just looked out at the overgrown tracks, at the trees pressing close on either side, and sipped her tea. Finally she spoke. Why are you doing this? Elira didn't answer right away. She watched a bird land on the rusted rail, its head cocking sideways as if curious. Because he loved trains, she said quietly. Because I don't know what else to do. Senna nodded slowly. Some griefs need a place to live. Maybe this is yours. Elira felt something tighten in her throat. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded. Senna stayed a little longer, then left with a gentle squeeze of Elira's shoulder. Don't work too hard, she said. The station's not going anywhere. But Elira wasn't sure that was true. That night, she stayed later than usual. She'd been trying to wind the station clock, standing on a stepladder with Matthias's wrench in hand, but the mechanism was seized. No amount of coaxing would make the gears turn. She'd tried oil, tried patience, tried sheer stubbornness. Nothing. The hands stayed frozen at 3:47. She climbed down, frustrated, and set the wrench back in the toolbox. Fine, she muttered. Stay stuck. The station seemed to sigh around her. The wind pushing through gaps in the walls, the creak of old wood settling. She was about to leave when she heard it. Footsteps, not hers, not the creak of the building. Footsteps, deliberate, slow, coming from the far end of the platform. Elira froze, her pulse quickening. Hello? No answer. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty platform, the rusted tracks, the overgrown weeds. Nothing moved. No one was there. But the air felt different, charged, and like the moment before a storm breaks. She swept the light across the platform one more time, then stopped. On the bench near the entrance, the one she'd scrubbed clean just that morning, sat a single flower. Fresh. White petals, still dewy. Stem cleanly cut. Elira's breath caught. She walked slowly toward it, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. She knelt and picked up the flower, turning it over in her fingers. It smelled faintly of earth, and something sweeter. Jasmine, maybe. No one had been here. She was certain. She'd been alone all evening, and yet. She stood, clutching the flower, and looked out into the darkness beyond the platform. The tracks stretched away into nothing, swallowed by trees and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the sound of breathing, or maybe it was just the wind. She stepped back inside the station, closed the door, and locked it. The flower sat on the ticket counter beside Matthias's toolbox, impossibly bright in the dim light. Elira stood at the window, watching the empty tracks, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Not fear, not quite, unease. The station had been silent for 43 years, but tonight it felt like something was waking up. Elira was painting the exterior trim when she heard the footsteps. Not the uncertain shuffle of someone lost, not the casual stride of a passerby. These were deliberate, purposeful, the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She set down the brush and turned. A man stood on the platform, a worn leather suitcase at his feet. He was perhaps 60, his face weathered by sun and time, deep lines etched around his eyes. He wore a faded coat and scuffed boots, and he was looking at the station the way someone might look at an old friend they hadn't seen in years. Elira wiped her hands on her jeans and walked toward him. Can I help you? He glanced at her, then back at the station. Is this Ashbourne Junction? It is, but... She hesitated. There are no trains here. Haven't been for years. I know. The way he said it made her pause. Not disappointed, not surprised, just certain. He picked up his suitcase and stepped toward the entrance. May I come in? Elira found herself nodding before she understood why. Inside, the station was brighter than it had been in decades. The windows she'd replaced let morning light flood the waiting room. warming the freshly sanded ticket counter. The floor was clean now, the smell of mildew replaced by wood soap and paint. It almost looked like a place people might want to be. The man, Torin, he said, his name was Torin Kyle, set his suitcase down and walked slowly through the space, running his fingers along the edge of the counter. "You've done beautiful work here." "Thank you." Alera watched him carefully. "But I still don't understand. If you know there are no trains—" "I needed to leave somewhere," he said quietly. This felt like the right place. He moved toward the departures board and stood before it, hands in his pockets, studying the faded destinations. His expression was strange, focused, almost reverent, as if he were reading something she couldn't see. Alera felt a chill run through her. "What do you see?" "Names," he said softly. Then he shook his head. "Sorry, I don't mean to be cryptic. It's just, I've been wandering for a long time, since my daughter stopped speaking to me." He turned to face her, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. Not physical tiredness, something deeper. "I said things I shouldn't have," he continued, "cruel things. I was angry about her choices, and I broke something I don't know how to fix." Alera's throat tightened. She knew that weight, the kind that settled in your chest and never quite left. "So you came here," she said. "I didn't plan to." He gave a small, sad smile. "I was just driving. But when I saw the sign for Ashbourne Junction, something pulled me off the highway. I don't even know why." He gestured toward the frozen clock above the entrance. "What time does the next train depart?" Alera followed his gaze. 3:47. Always 3:47. She should have told him the truth again, that the station was just a building, that no trains would ever come, that whatever he was looking for, he wouldn't find it here. But she didn't. Instead, she heard herself say, "Dusk, around 6. Torin nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. "Then I'll wait." He sat on one of the benches near the window, his suitcase beside him, and looked out at the empty tracks. Alera stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure what to do. Finally, she returned to her painting, though she kept glancing back at him through the windows. He didn't move for hours. She brought him tea around midday. He accepted it with a quiet thank you and wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. They sat together in a silence that felt almost comfortable. "Do you think some places remember the people who passed through them?" he asked eventually. Alera stared into her own tea. She thought of Matthias standing on this platform 30 years ago, laughing, full of life. She thought of all the travelers who'd waited here over the decades, carrying their own stories, their own grief and hope and longing. "Yes," she said finally, "I think they do." Torin nodded. "I think so too." As the afternoon stretched toward evening, he stood and picked up his suitcase. Alera rose with him, her heart suddenly racing. "Where will you go?" He gestured toward the tracks. "That way, I think." "There's nothing out there, just woods and old rail." "I know." He smiled at her, and this time it reached his eyes. "But sometimes you don't need a destination. You just need to leave." He walked to the edge of the platform and paused, looking back at her. "Thank you for letting me wait." "I didn't do anything." "You did more than you think." Then he stepped down onto the tracks and began walking. His figure grew smaller and smaller, swallowed by the trees and the fading light. Alera stood at the edge of the platform, watching until he disappeared completely. The station felt different now, less empty, as if something had shifted in the air, in the walls, in the very bones of the place. She went back inside and noticed the flower on the bench, the one that had appeared mysteriously days ago. It was wilted now, its petals browning at the edges. She picked it up gently and carried it to the ticket counter. where she filled a glass with water and placed the flower inside. It wouldn't revive. She knew that. But it felt important to try. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the departures board. Belshire, Creston, Milford, Vale, names of places. But Torn had seen something else. Names of people, maybe. Or emotions. Or unfinished journeys. Alara reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of chalk. She hesitated, then wrote carefully at the bottom of the board, beneath the faded destinations. Torrin. The name looked small and strange there, but somehow it felt right. She stepped back and looked at it. The station seemed to exhale around her, the way it did sometimes when the wind moved through the broken places. But this time, it didn't sound mournful. It sounded almost grateful. The station master's office had been locked for decades. Alara found the key in a rusted tin box beneath the ticket counter, tucked behind a loose board she'd discovered while repairing the floor. The key was small and tarnished, but it fit the office door perfectly. The hinges screamed as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust. Sunlight filtered through a single grimy window, illuminating shelves lined with old ledgers, filing cabinets with drawers half open, and a desk buried under yellowed papers. Everything smelled of age and abandonment, of things left behind and never reclaimed. She'd been looking for wiring diagrams. The lights in the waiting room were temperamental, and she thought the office might hold the original electrical plans. But as she moved through the space, opening drawers and sorting through files, she found something else, a hidden compartment in the desk. It was cleverly designed. A false bottom in the center drawer that only revealed itself when she pulled too hard and the wood splintered. Beneath it lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. Alara lifted it carefully. The pages were brittle at the edges, threatening to crumble if she wasn't gentle. She carried it to the window, where the light was better, and opened it to the first page. Property of Edgar Haltman, Station Master, Ashbourne Junction. June 1943. Her breath caught. She turned the pages slowly, reading entries written in careful, slanted handwriting. The early entries were mundane. Records of train schedules, passenger counts, maintenance notes. But halfway through, the tone shifted. October the 12th, 1943. Margaret died today. The clock in the station stopped at 3:47, the exact moment she passed. I tried to wind it, but the gears won't turn. Perhaps it's just as well. Time feels false now. Arbitrary. Alara's hands trembled. October 19, 1943. A woman came to the station this morning. She had no luggage, no ticket. When I told her the trains were suspended due to the war, she said, "I know, but I needed to leave somewhere." She sat on the platform for hours, then walked away down the tracks. I don't know where she went. October 27, 1943. Another visitor, a man this time. He asked when the next train would depart. I couldn't bring myself to tell him never. So I said, "When you're ready." He nodded and sat on the bench. At dusk, he left the same way the woman had. Down the tracks. Into the trees. Alara's pulse quickened. She flipped forward, scanning the entries. November 8, 1943. They keep coming. I don't understand it, but they do. People who need to leave something behind. Grief, regret, shame, fear. They arrive with nothing and depart with less. I've started calling this place what it truly is, the platform of unfinished journeys. Her chest tightened. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she kept reading. December 3, 1943. I asked one of them, a young soldier, why he came here. He said, "Because it felt like the only place that would let me go." I understand now. This station holds space for those who can't move forward, but don't know how to stay still. Margaret would have loved that. She always said train stations were liminal places, between where you've been and where you're going, between who you were and who you'll become. Alira closed her eyes, pressing the journal against her chest. She felt the weight of it. Not just the book, but the decades of sorrow it contained. She opened it again to the final entry. January 15, 1944. My wife is gone. The trains have stopped. The war goes on, but as long as they need it, I will keep this station open. Not for travel, for departure. There is a difference. The handwriting ended there. No explanation, no closure, just silence. Alira set the journal down on the desk and walked slowly back to the waiting room. Her mind was reeling, trying to piece together what she'd just learned. Edgar Haltman had done this, had kept Ashbourne Junction alive after it closed, not for trains, but for people who needed to leave, emotionally, spiritually, symbolically. And Matthias had known. He must have. He'd bought this place 6 months before he died. He'd left her the deed. He'd brought her here. Not to restore a building, but to finish something. Her own unfinished journey. She stood before the departures board and stared at the faded destinations. Belshire, Creston, Milford, Vale. And then she saw them. Faint names written in chalk so light they were almost invisible. Names that hadn't been there before, or that she simply hadn't seen. They were layered beneath the destinations. Ghostly and ephemeral. Clara, Thomas, Isabel, Samuel. Names of people who had come here, who had stood where she was standing, who had left something behind. Her throat tightened. She reached for the piece of chalk she'd used to write Torrin's name and held it in her hand, feeling its weight. Then she looked up at the frozen clock. 3:47. The moment Edgar's wife had died. The moment time had stopped for him, just as it had stopped for Alira when Matthias's heart gave out. She whispered his name, Matthias. The station seemed to hold its breath. She lifted the chalk and wrote carefully at the top of the board, above all the other names, in letters bold and clear, Matthias Voss. Her hand trembled as she lowered the chalk. She pressed her palm flat against the board, feeling the rough wood beneath her fingers, and let herself cry. Not the silent, swallowed tears she'd been carrying for months. Real heaving sobs that shook her entire body. When she finally stopped, the station felt different again. Not empty, not haunted, just present. She wiped her eyes and looked at the board. Matthias's name stared back at her, solid and real. He wasn't coming back. She knew that. But maybe that was the point. Maybe departure wasn't about leaving someone behind. Maybe it was about giving yourself permission to keep going. She stepped back and looked around the station. At the clean floors, the repaired windows, the ticking silence where the clock still refused to move. I'll keep it open, she said aloud, as long as they need it. The wind moved through the station, soft and low, and for just a moment it sounded like an answer. Words spread the way secrets do in small towns. Quietly, carefully, through whispered conversations and knowing glances. The widow at Ashbourne Junction will listen. Alira didn't know who'd started the rumor, but within 2 weeks of writing Matthias's name on the departures board, people began arriving. Not many, not crowds, just 1 or 2 at a time, appearing on the platform with the same uncertain hope Torrin had carried. The first was a woman named Clara. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back in a loose braid and eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to rest. She stood at the entrance for a long time before stepping inside. Alira was lighting candles in the waiting room when she noticed her. The electricity was still unreliable, and the soft glow of candlelight made the space feel warmer, almost sacred. "Can I help you?" Alira asked. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "My son died in the war. Afghanistan. 3 years ago." Alira set down the matches and gestured to the bench. "Sit, please." Clara sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I keep his room exactly as he left it. His clothes, his books, even his coffee mug on the nightstand. My husband says I need to let go, but I don't. I don't know how." Alira didn't offer platitudes. She'd learned from Torin that people didn't come here for comfort. They came for permission. "What was his name?" "Daniel." Alira walked to the departures board and held out a piece of chalk. "Write it here. When you're ready." Clara stood slowly, as if her legs might not hold her. She took the chalk with trembling fingers and stared at the board for a long moment. Then carefully, she wrote, "Daniel." She stepped back, tears streaming down her face. "What now?" "Now you leave," Alira said softly. "Down the tracks, if you want. Or just out the door. But you leave something behind." Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. She placed it on the ticket counter beside Matthias's toolbox, her fingers lingering on the worn wood. Then she walked out onto the platform, down the steps, and disappeared into the trees. Alira stood alone in the candlelight, staring at the photograph. A young man in uniform, smiling. She picked it up gently and placed it on a shelf behind the counter, next to the wilted flower in its glass. They kept coming. A man who'd never apologized to his brother before he died. A young woman who'd abandoned her family and couldn't forgive herself. An elderly father who'd said cruel words to his daughter and never taken them back. Each one arrived carrying something too heavy to hold. Each one left something behind. A letter, a ring, a set of keys, a lock of hair. The station became a repository of unfinished journeys, lined with small tokens of grief and regret. Alira listened to every story. She didn't judge, didn't offer solutions. She just held space for their sorrow and invited them to write a name on the board. Some asked about the clock. "Why doesn't it move?" an older man asked one afternoon, staring up at the frozen hands. "Because it's not time yet," Alira said. "Whose time?" She didn't answer. Others noticed Matthias's toolbox on the counter. Alira had placed it there deliberately, open, his tools visible. She didn't use them anymore. Instead, she left them as an offering, a way for visitors to repair what they'd broken. Even if only symbolically. A woman used his hammer to fix a loose board on the platform. A man borrowed his screwdriver to tighten the hinges on the waiting room door. Each time someone touched his tools, Alira felt a strange mixture of comfort and loss. She was sharing him. But she couldn't let him go. Weeks passed, the departures board filled with names, layered over one another in chalk until the wood was almost white. The candles burned lower. The station hummed with a quiet energy that felt alive. But Alira's own name never appeared on the board. One night, after the last visitor had left, she sat alone on the platform, legs dangling over the edge, and stared at the empty tracks. The moon was full, casting silver light across the rusted rails. She thought about all the people who'd come here, all the burdens they'd set down, all the names they'd written, and she thought about Matthias. His name was still at the top of the board, bold, unmovable, a monument. She'd been helping others depart while holding on to him with both hands, keeping his tools visible, refusing to wind the clock. Speaking to him every night as if he might answer. For years, she thought the only way to honor him was to hold on, to keep him close, to carry his memory like a second heartbeat. But sitting there in the silver moonlight, she realized something that made her chest ache. She was wrong. Sometimes love doesn't mean holding on. Sometimes it means learning to let the train leave the station, even if you're not on it. She thought of Edgar Haltman, keeping the clock frozen at 3:47 for the rest of his life. She thought of Clara, preserving her son's room like a shrine. She thought of all the people who came here, unable to move forward because they couldn't bear to leave the past behind. And she understood. Grief wasn't the problem. Grief was love with nowhere to go. The problem was thinking that love required stasis, that honoring someone meant stopping time. Alira stood and walked back inside the station. Her hands were shaking. She lit a new candle, a tall white one she'd been saving without knowing why. She carried it outside and placed it carefully on the platform's edge, where the moonlight touched it. "I love you," she whispered. "I will always love you. But I can't stay at this station forever." The flame flickered, bending toward her as if listening. "If you've ever held on to something you should have let go, maybe you understand." She looked out at the empty tracks, at the trees swaying in the wind, at the names written in chalk behind her. Subscribe, because some stories heal when they're shared. The wind moved through the station, carrying the scent of candle smoke and earth. For just a moment, it felt like an answer, like permission. Elira sat beside the candle and cried, not the hollow, aching sobs of early grief. Something softer, something that felt almost like release. The candle burned steadily beside her, its light small but bright against the darkness. Senna found her at midnight. Elira was standing in the center of the platform, staring up at the frozen clock, the candle still burning beside her feet. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. Her mind was too loud, too full of everything she'd been avoiding for months. "What are you waiting for?" Elira turned. Senna stood at the edge of the platform, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her face soft with concern. "I don't know," Elira said quietly. Senna stepped closer, her gaze moving from the candle to the departures board, covered in names, then back to Elira. "Yes, you do." Elira's throat tightened. She looked away, back at the clock. 3:47. Always 3:47. "I thought if I restored this place," she said, her voice breaking, "he'd come back somehow. Like if I made it beautiful enough, if I honored it the way he would have. He'd walk through that door and tell me I did a good job." Senna said nothing. She just waited. "But he's not coming back." "No," Senna said gently, "but you're still here." The words landed like stones in water, rippling outward through Elira's chest. She pressed her palms against her face and let out a shuddering breath. "I don't know how to be here without him." "You've been learning," Senna said. "Every person who walked through that door, you gave them permission to leave. Maybe it's time to give yourself the same." Elira lowered her hands and looked at the older woman. "How?" Senna gestured towards the clock. "You know how." Elira's pulse quickened. She walked slowly to the base of the platform, where the stepladder still leaned against the wall from her last failed attempt to wind the mechanism. She picked it up, carried it beneath the clock, and climbed. The metal of the clock face was cold beneath her fingers, colder than she remembered. She reached for the winding mechanism. A small key embedded in the clock's side, and gripped it tightly. Her hands trembled. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," Senna said from below. "Do it anyway." Elira turned the key. At first nothing happened. The gears resisted, seized by decades of stillness. She turned harder, her knuckles white, her breath coming fast. And then, a click. The gears caught. The second hand shuddered, then moved, one tick, then another. The sound filled the station, impossibly loud in the silence. a relentless mechanical heartbeat that echoed off the walls and ceiling. Tick, tick, tick. Alira climbed down, her legs shaking, and stepped back to look. The clock showed 3:48, 1 minute forward. She felt something break open inside her. Not grief exactly, but the cage she'd built around it. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the moving hands, at time resuming its march after 43 years of suspension. Senna walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. There. That wasn't so terrible, was it? Alira laughed through her tears. It was awful. Most necessary things are. Alira turned and walked back to the ticket counter. Matthias's toolbox sat there, still open, his tools arranged, just as they'd been for weeks. She stared at them for a long moment. The hammer, the screwdrivers, the worn wooden handles that had fit his hands so perfectly. Then she reached up and slid the wedding ring off her finger. It left a pale band of skin beneath, a ghost of where it had lived for 30 years. She held the ring in her palm, feeling its weight, its warmth from her body. "I'm not abandoning you," she said aloud, her voice steady now. "I'm just releasing the weight." She placed the ring carefully inside the toolbox, nestled among the tools. Then she closed the lid, slowly, deliberately, and latched it shut. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt louder than it should have. She lifted the toolbox and carried it to the shelf behind the counter, placing it beside the photograph of Daniel in his uniform, beside the wilted flower in its glass, beside all the other tokens people had left behind. It sat there, solid and final, a monument, but no longer a burden she had to carry every day. Alira turned and walked to the departures board. The names covered nearly every inch of wood now, layered, overlapping, some faded to ghosts. At the very top, bold and clear, was Matthias's name. She picked up a piece of chalk and stood before the board, her hand hovering over the surface. Then, directly beneath his name, she wrote her own, Alira Voss. She stepped back, staring at the two names together, husband and wife, joined even in departure. Senna came to stand beside her. "There? Now you're both travelers." Alira nodded, unable to speak. She turned toward the open doorway, toward the platform, where the candle still burned. The wind moved through the station, carrying the scent of earth and smoke and something sweeter. Jasmine, maybe, or the memory of it. She walked to the edge of the platform and looked up at the clock. 3:49 now. Time was moving. The world was moving. And so was she. She spoke aloud, her voice soft but clear, as if Matthias might hear her wherever he was. "I loved you. I will always love you. But I can't stay at this station forever." The wind answered, pushing through the broken places, gentle and insistent. "You wanted me to live," she continued, "not to guard your memory like a relic. To live. So that's what I'm going to do." The candle flame bent toward her, then straightened. The station seemed to sigh, not with sorrow, but with something that felt almost like relief. Senna touched her arm gently. "Come on, let's get you home." "Wait." Alira walked back inside and stood in the center of the waiting room, looking around at everything she'd restored, the clean floors, the repaired windows, the departures board covered in names, the clock ticking steadily above the door. It was beautiful, not because it looked new, but because it had been given purpose again. "Thank you," she whispered to the station, to Matthias, to Edgar Haltman, and everyone who'd ever stood here, caught between leaving and staying. Then she walked out onto the platform, extinguished the candle with a soft breath, and followed Senna into the night. Behind her, the station stood silent under the stars. But inside, The clock kept ticking. 3:50, 3:51, 3:52. Time, at last, was moving forward. The days after felt softer somehow, like waking from a fever. Elira still came to the station every morning, but she no longer arrived at dawn with the desperate urgency of someone trying to outrun her own thoughts. She came later now, when the sun was already warm on the platform, when the light through the windows had turned golden instead of gray. She brought books, a sketch pad, a thermos of tea. She sat on the bench near the ticket counter and read for hours, glancing up occasionally to watch dust motes drift through the light. The clock ticked steadily above the door, its sound no longer deafening, but almost comforting. A reminder that time was moving, that she was moving with it. The station felt different now, still sacred, but less heavy, as if the weight it had carried for so long, Edgar's grief, her own, the accumulated sorrow of everyone who'd passed through, had finally begun to lift. Fewer people came, not because the station had stopped working, but because it had already served its purpose for most who needed it. A woman arrived one morning, wrote a name on the board, left a folded letter on the counter, and departed without speaking. That was all. No confession, no long vigil, just release. Elira understood. Some departures were quiet. She spent her afternoons maintaining the space, sweeping the floors, trimming the weeds along the platform, polishing the ticket counter until it gleamed. But now she also painted. Small watercolors of the station at different times of day. The way light fell through the windows at noon. The way shadows stretched across the platform at dusk. She'd forgotten she liked to paint. One afternoon, while mixing colors on her palette, she laughed. A small, surprised sound that startled her so much she dropped her brush. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed. The sound echoed through the empty station, and for a moment, she felt embarrassed, as if someone might have heard. But then she picked up the brush, smiled to herself, and kept painting. That evening, she drove to the cemetery. Matthias's grave was on a hill overlooking the valley, beneath an oak tree that had been there longer than either of them. She knelt on the grass beside the headstone and traced his name with her fingertips. Matthias Voss, beloved husband, faithful friend. I wound the clock," she said quietly. "It's ticking now. I thought you'd want to know." The wind moved through the oak leaves above her, rustling softly. People have been coming to the station, not for trains, for permission, I think, to leave things behind. Grief, regret, all the things we carry that make it hard to move forward. She sat back on her heels, looking out at the valley below. The town was small from here, just a cluster of rooftops and streets threaded together like a quilt. "I've been helping them," she continued, "the way Edgar Haltman did, the way you wanted me to, I think, even if you didn't say it." Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She'd done enough crying. "I wrote my name on the board, next to yours. I thought that meant I was leaving you behind, but I don't think that's what it means at all." She reached out and touched the headstone again, feeling the cool granite beneath her palm. "You're not here. You're not at the station either. But you're still somewhere. In the tools I used, in the way I listen now, in the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you instead of pretending I'm fine." She smiled, tears blurring her vision. "I don't need to keep vigil anymore. You don't need me to stand guard over your memory. You need me to live." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of earth and grass and distant rain. "So that's what I'm going to do." She stayed a little longer, sitting in the grass with her back against the oak tree, watching the light fade over the valley. Then she stood, kissed her fingertips, and pressed them to his name. "I'll come back," she said. But not every day. Not like before. She walked back to her car feeling lighter than she had in months. A week later, Torn returned. Alara was watering the flower boxes she'd installed along the platform for Kosamatham, new ones, filled with marigolds and geraniums, when she heard footsteps. She turned and saw him standing at the entrance, the same worn coat, the same kind eyes, but he looked different, rested, whole. "I wanted to thank you," he said, stepping onto the platform. Alara set down the watering can. "You don't have to." "I do," he smiled. "I reconciled with my daughter. It took time, a lot of conversations I didn't think I could have, but I did, because of this place, because you let me leave." Alara felt warmth spread through her chest. "I'm glad." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the tracks. "What will you do now?" Torrin asked. Alara thought about it. The question didn't frighten her the way it might have a month ago. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think that's okay." Torrin nodded. "It is." He left the way he'd come, walking down the platform steps and disappearing into the trees. Alara watched him go, then turned back to the station. The clock showed 4:23, time moving steadily forward. She walked inside and stood before the departures board. The names were still there, layered, overlapping, ghostly. She picked up a cloth and began gently erasing them, not to forget, not to erase the grief they represented, but to make space for whatever came next. The board slowly cleared, revealing the old destinations beneath. Belshire, Creston, Milford, Vale. Places she'd never been, roads she'd never traveled. Maybe one day she would. That evening, she sat on the edge of the platform, legs dangling over the side, and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky turned to orange, then pink, then deep purple. Stars began to appear, one by one, like small permissions to hope. The station was quiet behind her. The clock ticked. The wind moved through the broken places, but it didn't sound mournful anymore. It sounded like breathing. Alara closed her eyes and let herself imagine it. A life beyond this platform, beyond grief's architecture. Not a life without Matthias, but a life that honored him by being fully lived. She didn't know what it would look like yet, but for the first time in a long time, she wanted to find out. 6 months later, Ashbourne Junction was alive again. Not in the way it had been 43 years ago, with trains arriving and departing on schedules painted in neat rows, but alive in a different way. Warmer, softer, more human. Alara stood behind the counter, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs, and smiled as she watched the morning unfold. The waiting room had been transformed into a small cafe, with tables scattered near the windows, and wooden chairs painted in soft blues and greens. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of flowers. Bright yellow tulips in a vase on the counter. Locals had started gathering here in the mornings. Old men playing chess by the window. Mothers meeting for tea while their children played on the platform outside. Travelers stopping for a warm meal and a moment of rest before continuing their journeys. The station had become a place of arrival instead of departure. Alara had hired help, a young man named Oliver who made excellent pastries and didn't ask too many questions about the station's history. He worked the early shift, giving Alara time to paint or visit Matthias's grave, or simply sit in the sun. She glanced up at the clock above the door. 10:15. The hands moved steadily, reliably, marking time that no longer felt like an enemy. Matthias's toolbox sat on a shelf behind the counter, visible but no longer central. Sometimes people asked about it, and she'd tell them it belonged to her husband. that he'd loved trains and old buildings, and the idea that broken things could be made whole again. She didn't cry when she said it anymore. The departures board was gone now, painted over with a new message in simple white letters. Welcome. Rest here as long as you need. Elira had considered leaving the old names visible beneath the paint, but in the end, she'd decided against it. The people who'd come to depart had already left. This was a different chapter now, a different kind of sanctuary. The bell above, the door chimed. Elira looked up and saw a young woman standing in the entrance, her eyes red-rimmed, her shoulders hunched as if carrying something too heavy. She looked around the cafe uncertainly, as if she'd expected something else. Elira recognized that look. She'd worn it herself not so long ago. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. "Can I help you?" The woman hesitated. "Is this... I heard there was a train station here, that people came here when they needed to leave something behind." Elira's chest tightened with understanding. That was true once, but things have changed. The woman's face fell. "Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have... Wait!" Elira gestured to a table near the window. "Sit. Let me make you some tea." The woman sat slowly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Elira returned with 2 mugs of tea and a plate of Oliver's almond biscuits. She sat across from the woman and waited. "My father died 3 months ago," the woman said quietly. "I didn't get to say goodbye. I was traveling when it happened, and by the time I got home, it was too late." Elira reached across the table and covered the woman's hand with her own. "I'm sorry. Everyone keeps telling me to move on, that he wouldn't want me to be sad. But I don't know how to move on when I never got to say goodbye." Elira thought about Matthias, about the stroke that took him so quickly there'd been no time for last words, about all the things she'd wanted to say and never could. "You don't have to move on," Elira said gently. "Not yet. Not before you're ready." The woman looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Then what do I do?" "You sit here. You drink your tea. You breathe." Elira squeezed her hand. "You don't have to leave yet. But when you're ready, the door is open." They sat together in silence, the clock ticking steadily above them, the morning light warming the room. After a while, the woman's shoulders softened. Her breathing slowed. The weight she'd been carrying seemed just a little lighter. When she finally left, she smiled at Elira. Small and fragile, but real. Elira stood in the doorway and watched her walk away, the same way she'd watched Torrin and Clara and all the others who'd come seeking something they couldn't name. She thought about Edgar Haltman, keeping the station open after his wife died, offering a platform for unfinished journeys. She thought about Matthias, buying this place, knowing she'd need it one day. And she thought about herself, the woman who'd arrived here months ago, desperate to restore something that was already gone. "I thought restoration meant bringing back what was lost," she realized. But sometimes it means making space for what comes next. Matthias hadn't needed her to guard his memory like a relic. He hadn't needed her to freeze time at 3:47 and live in the moment of his death forever. He'd needed her to live, to laugh again, to paint, to make coffee for strangers and listen to their grief without drowning in her own, to honor him by being fully, messily, courageously alive. She walked back inside and looked around the cafe. Oliver was wiping down tables, humming softly to himself. An elderly couple sat by the window, holding hands across the table. A child's laughter echoed from the platform outside. The station was full of life now. Not the life it had known 43 years ago, but something new. Something that hadn't existed before she'd arrived with Matthias's toolbox and a heart full of questions. She glanced at the clock. 10:45. Time moving steadily forward. That evening, after the cafe closed and Oliver went home, Elera stood alone on the platform and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky turned gold, then orange, then deep purple. In the distance, she heard the whistle of a train. Not here, but on a neighboring line that had been restored recently. The sound was faint but clear, a reminder that some journeys did continue. Behind her, the station glowed with warm light from the windows. The clock ticked. The flowers in their vases swayed gently in the breeze. Elira closed her eyes and let herself feel it. Not grief exactly, but something softer. Gratitude, maybe. For Matthias. For the station. For the people who'd trusted her with their sorrow and their hope. For the fact that she was still here. Still breathing. Still becoming. She opened her eyes and looked out at the tracks stretching into the distance, disappearing into trees and shadow. She didn't know where they led, didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. Behind her, the clock chimed 11. Time at last was hers again.